This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, kickstarts today's show with his grain market outlook, where he touches on the market's recent volatility and WASDE report expectations. K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner keeps the show rolling as he talks about the value of communication in the workplace and shares a few reminders about good communication with listeners. Ending the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond as he explains how Kansas has experienced a wide variety of weather in the past week and if it can be expected again. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what are we seeing in the futures market along with all this movement and volatility we've seen in the past week?
Well, I think you've described it well, and that uncertainty about trade directions going forward. Again, the back and forth of discussions about tariffs, this and whatever else that, much less all that's going on with regard to geopolitical conflicts in the world, particularly the Black Sea region, brought a good amount of uncertainty into these markets, and that follows on the pretty bearish projections that came out of the USDA Ag Outlook Conference last week on Thursday, Friday. So lots going on. We did see closes yesterday on Thursday, the 6th of March at 449.5 for March contract. And that's, we're into delivery period now. So we're really focusing more on the May contract, which is 464, and the D's contract at 451. So after all this week's volatility where we went lower than that, now we came back and again, yesterday for corn, the May contract closed up 8.25 cents. We almost gained back what we lost coming out of the USDA report and USDA Outlook Conference, everything else that was happening. So did see that come back. For soybean futures, yesterday closed up 15.5 cents for the May contract, 1027.5. And again, almost exactly where we were a week ago. So movement, volatility, not a lot of direct change, just is what it is. The November contract, by the way, for soybeans at 10.34.25. The D's contract for corn, 451. So, even with all the uncertainty, we're holding in pretty steady on those new crop contracts. And I think that's just indicative that, hey, there's a lot of our own crop production uncertainty in front of us that has to be dealt with. So you still have some support there. The wheat contract, CME Kansas hard red winter wheat closed yesterday, Thursday, 565.75, up about 8.75 cents. So again, even there, it's movement to the high side. July contract, 579.5, also up 8.25. So interesting. I would say that you still have quite the set of carries. At least that's how I view them. Carrying charges in the wheat contract. We from the March to May contract, over 7 cents a bushel a month. May to July, almost 7. From July to September, still moving higher to 7 and 3/8, and then on to D's up 7. So that type of carry in the wheat market won't stay around. If we get into mid-April and we still have wheat at 565.75, that would mean we haven't had any big crop threats, et cetera, and we probably start to see a decline in those wheat futures complex for hard red going into the future. So again, that's thought-provoking to me. We show so much in terms of positive carry in wheat, but if we stay at these price levels again below $6, I would wonder in the last half of the year if you'd still have these type of price levels. So a lot depends on where that's going. I should add in, our colleague Chip Redmond has been talking a lot about weather prospects for the summer. And I don't know exactly all the details of what he said, but he does raise the prospect of a not insignificant risk of hot, dry weather. So we just talked about where new crop D's corn's 451 as of yesterday. Again, November 1020.75, and here July at 579.5. These are not not top end prices. Generally, we would see think of something with a 5 for corn, 11, 12, 13 for soybeans, wheat $6, $7 as being drought affected prices. So we're sitting here right now in these markets, really not pricing in really hardly any of that risk, other than maybe in wheat with its strong carries. So there's a lot of what we've talked about, movement and uncertainty within the last week or so. I think the weighing of these weather risks probably is likely to give us even more focus on what could happen if we get that type of hot, dry weather, and brings at least the potential for a lot of price movement and volatility heading off into spring. Again, April, May, June, July. We'll see where all that goes. At this time, with a lot of the issues going on in the world economy, and again, trade contentions all up in the air. We're tending to bid the downside on where things are at, but otherwise, we have a lot of risk in front of us. And if you don't mind, in taking some of that point of view and bringing that back into those USDA projections for this year. So take corn, for instance. So if we end up and have something other than the USDA's projection, 181 bushels an acre, 15.6 billion bushels of production. And let's say we get, instead of 181 bushels an acre, let's say we get something like 178, 3 bushels an acre less. Well, that's about 185 to 190 million bushels less than what we'd project. If we would really have a serious drought, well, say 175, 176. That's moderately serious in terms of where we've been. That's 5 bushel an acre times 90. Then you're taking half a billion bushels off of that production number, down to 15 billion. And the ending stocks numbers, in essence, you'd bring about rationing of usage from what the USDA was talking about. And you'd be closer to 1.5 billion, 1.4 billion bushels carry out. And we probably wouldn't be sitting at $4.20. It'd be something, $4.75, $4.50 thereabouts. And for soybeans, again, the USDA's balance sheet came in strong yield projection, 52.5 billion bushels. I think we've struggled to get anywhere near 51 and a half, 52 in the past. Well, if we take if you would take that down to 50 bushels an acre, so that would be about 200 million bushels on total, 210 by the time you look at the harvested acres. And instead of 4.37, you're down closer to 4.1 or 4 billion bushels. Ending stocks, instead of 320 million, well, you're down to 150 to 200, and you're probably not looking at $10 soybeans. You're looking at something much higher. So got all that in play, and wheat would be affected as well. Although we've with all that's happening in the world and world wheat market, it's been hard to see a lot of price responsiveness. But still, dry conditions would impact the wheat market domestically. And again, instead of 550, we'd see something to the higher side, closer to six plus, I would think. So you had that situation, and I guess Shelby, as we sit here in early March each year, knowing that April, May, June, July, all that in the field, crops planted, crop development, those typical concerns that happen. I know where we're at right now, but gosh, there's a lot of risk that has to be dealt with heading on into the future, and it just looks like where we're at this point is. You always you're hesitant as the economist to make a projection, but if we get this type of domestic crop production risk coming about in any way, then the prices we'd be looking at now would be pretty much the low ebb. But yes, I know exports are important and absolutely impact things, but once we start to focus on our own production prospects, then we shift gears really to looking at crop development. Yeah, again, although exports will be important, it'll be the size of supply that'll I would think will mainly drive the markets, and we'd see where it would go from there.
When you see those pre-report estimates and projections, did you see any surprises?
There's a report coming out on Tuesday. That'd be the March USDA WASDE report, and really, when you look at the wheat numbers, the corn numbers, soybean numbers, pretty much steady as she goes in terms of the March estimates being pretty much the same as for the February numbers, February 11th, I think it was. The corn number is down about 25 million bushels, down to 1.516 billion. So that there's some expectation of continued strong usage of corn that would be supportive to the market if that came about. We'd also had seen a projection, an expectation that the USDA will continue to trim away at the Argentine corn crop number. Again, the projection that coming out of February was 50 million metric tons. The lowest trade estimate down to 47, the average about 49. So there's an expectation there of some damage. It's hard to say what the USDA will do. However, when you look at the drought maps in that part of the world, it looks like that. It doesn't look like a well-watered garden down there. It looks pretty dry on their maps. But again, when you look at the other projections, almost no changes. And in our materials that we put on AgManager, you can see the latest weather maps that are available around the world. And depending on which map you see, you're looking at parts of Europe awfully dry, and that would affect wheat markets, other feed grains like barley, et cetera, and what's coming out of Russia. Parts of South America dry. But again, at this time, I think it's fair to say, well, that there's still time before those crops actually come. However, there are areas of concern around the globe for major exporters that still have to be resolved, and the possibility of that crop production uncertainty having a positive impact on prices going forward.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about communication in the workplace with K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, as we're thinking about communication in the workplace, first thinking about there might be some preferred methods.
That's right. I think today as we think about the modern workplace and we just think about the different generations, you and I have talked about that before, there's many different forms of communication now that are out there. We have we were talking before we went on air about, the antiquated method is we have this organizational meeting every morning, in the workplace, and that doesn't happen all the time anymore. And then as you think about, email, text, different messaging platforms that are out there, I think we've got more different methods of communicating than maybe we've ever had before. And so that kind of changes communication in the workplace a little bit.
So when someone comes into maybe a new organization, a new workplace, needing to understand what communication is already set in place versus maybe trying to start something new right off the bat?
I think so. I think it's a really good question, especially for a new leader or if you're a new employee to an organization to come into that and just kind of get a sense of, well, what is the preferred method of communication? There's some people that are going to communicate very well via email. There's some people that oftentimes, like myself, are not in front of their computer, but they're in front of their phone. They're on the road. They're remote a lot of times. And so, a text or a phone call might be a better way to interact with that person. So there's just many different forms of communication that are out there. And so I think that's an important aspect of the workplace that we have to acknowledge. What are those preferred methods? What works well within this organization? And so as a new leader or a new employee, I think that's really good to get a sense of when we come into that organization.
Why do we care about communication in the workplace?
I mean, communication, we got to have it, right? That's essentially how we get the work done, right? We've got to, communicate, what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, all of those things. So I think it is important. We oftentimes don't think about it, right? But it's essential. We have to have it.
How is communication crucial for safety in the workplace?
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. And so every time I think about safety and the aspect of the industry that I work in, the beef industry, and how that relates, I think about emergency action plans. If we're looking for an example that highlights the importance of communication on an organization such as a feed yard, emergency action plans, kind of highlight that. And, in the event of X happening, right, this is how we're going to communicate. This is what we're going to communicate. This is where we're going to meet, right? All those things that you think about. And so, safety and communication, I think that highlights the importance of communication in that aspect. But it's every day, right? It's ongoing. It's how we get the work done. And so we can't underscore the value of communication really in the workplace. But there's some great examples.
While we're talking about communication in the workplace, is there value of sometimes sharing some personal information and not just always talking about work?
Yeah, so I think, that's a great issue. There's a couple bullet points, I guess, that I'll come back to as we think about communication. It's foundational, right? Okay, so communication, it's got to be, the goal is to convey information in a clear and concise manner. It needs to enhance the personal relationships. And so it needs to be positive, right? And so, as we think about the basis for communication, that's kind of the why we would communicate, right? And so getting back to that question, are there things that we should maybe share that are personal, versus the work communication? That's an interesting line, right? There's a fine line between what do we need to share about our personal life and what do we need to share, what do we need to keep as, appropriate workplace communication, right? So that's just a challenging question. But I do think that there are some things that we do need to share. Obviously, there's some things that go on in our personal lives that certainly impact our work life. We spend a lot of time at work. If we've had, a close family member that there's been a death in the family or there's something going on, that employee may need a little bit of grace. There may be some challenges they're facing. And so I do think there is a time where, that helps us in terms of the organization. One of the aspects of communication that I think we often, lose is it builds trust within an organization. We have to have an open environment where people feel comfortable, right? We need to build that trust and rapport. And so, sometimes, that line of knowing a little bit more about your employees or asking, hey, how are you doing? You've had a lot of sick days, recently. We obviously have to be careful, right, about asking some of those questions, and what people are willing to share. But I do think it's important. I think that just adds and builds trust and rapport within the workplace. And it just needs to be healthy and positive. I think we need to come back to that as well. Positive communication in the workplace.
What are some environmental aspects that you think create a more positive, welcoming communication in the workplace?
Let's break communication down as we get into that question into, the senders and the receivers, right? So if I think about the sender of the communication, right? So clearly define that message. Identify before we send the message, right? Identify the purpose of the message. What is the intent? And then more so than ever, we have these methods of communication like email and text they don't convey emotion, right? So as the sender, I think we have to be increasingly aware of the physical as well as the emotional environment that we're sending that message into. Word choice, right? Words don't have emotion, but they do, right? They carry with them emotional meaning and context. And, you're a communicator, right? So you certainly understand that. So let's talk a little bit about the receiver, okay? And so what I would encourage, this healthy workplace communication is focus on the message. What is being conveyed? I think it's also best to always assume positive intent, right? I mean, oftentimes as a receiver of a message, we insert our, emotions and, our own perspectives into that message. And we really need to be careful about that as receivers, that not to insert that emotional context into that message. Just, what's truly being said here. And assume that positive intent, right? So coming back to that healthy, positive, clearly conveying information in a positive manner, enhancing those personal relationships, if you will.
And on that receiving end, if something doesn't make sense, important to go back and ask before making assumptions?
Oh, exactly. I think, anytime there's something that's not clear in a workplace communication, it's perfectly acceptable to come back and ask some questions. Ask a clarifying question. Hey, what do you mean by this? I mean, we oftentimes assume, oh, they understand what I'm saying. Not always, right? I mean, so it's perfectly acceptable to come back and ask some clarifying questions, be engaged in the conversation. Of course, now you are the sender of the message. So you have to kind of think about your purpose, how you're going to do that. And, I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I overthink things when I'm drafting emails, but I think that's good, right? We just always have to be aware of, how we're communicating things, how they're going to be received. But come back to that. What's the intent? What are we trying to communicate about? I think that's really important.
What are some big what not to do's when it comes to communication?
We talk about what to do, what not to do. And so I think, be careful of inserting your own personal bias, right? There's sometimes, as you think about, the email that came across in all caps with an exclamation point, right? People can are going to perceive that very differently, right? It may have just been that they inadvertently got their caps, block stuck. It may have been that was the message and how they wanted to convey that. And so I think that's, some of the things of what not to do. We always want to use some good etiquette in those communications, like be polite. Think about the letters that you used to draft. And I think we've lost a little bit of that in the modern workplace, but that's a good thing to come back to of, be respectful, clearly state the objective. Here's what I'm communicating with you about. Here's what I need from you. Here are the questions. Here's what I would expect in return. So, just giving some, I don't know that we focus once again on the what not to do, but I think the what not to do is don't insert those things. Be aware of those things, of how we communicate.
And Justin, since you're a beef cattle specialist, any good pointers when it comes to working cattle, maybe with your family or your coworkers, some good points for communication there?
Yeah, great example of communication for the beef cattle specialist, who grew up on a farming and ranching environment. And it's always kind of interesting how communication can break down very rapidly when sorting cows, right? There's a lot of what I would call effective communication that can go on very quickly there. Just be sensitive. I think sometimes, I used to say the true test of any marriage is if you could, remodel a house or sort cattle together. That's probably true, right? If you want to kind of test your relationship, that's a good place to do it. I don't recommend that, but you can certainly learn a lot about each other really quickly in a rapid, high-paced environment. But, great example, Shelby.
Justin, if people want to find out more information, maybe read more on this, what should they do?
Yeah, so this is really an excerpt from an article in our KSU ASI newsletter, called the Management Minute that we've highlighted here several times. There's also a really great amount of literature that's out there on the internet, number of sources on communication in the workplace. It's a really important aspect, I think, of the modern workplace that a lot of people are starting to talk about a lot. And so there's a lot of good information that's out there.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, has Kansas been living up to Kansas standards this past week in terms of weather?
That is an excellent way to put it. Kansas, the weather could be extreme, typically within, a day or two of itself, and we had that by a long shot this week with really warm temperatures to start the week, and then that came to a crashing halt with an impressive storm system that came close to setting pressure records in the eastern side of the state with the lowest recorded pressure. I don't think we actually got to that point. But we had some nasty winds behind that cold front on Tuesday and into Wednesday. We had wind gusts exceeding 70 miles an hour in several locations. There was a gust reported of 93, another one of 84 in southwest Kansas. Those are both, I'm almost 100% sure they were erroneous because of sensor issues. We didn't have that much wind anywhere in the vertical profile of the atmosphere. But impressive winds nonetheless, and we had a lot of blowing dust with that. We had blowing snow that even resulted in blizzard conditions, some pretty nasty blizzard conditions in northeast Kansas. We measured as much as 4 inches of snow in places. It's hard to measure that kind of snow when you have that significant of a wind. But definitely a dynamic. Probably the underlying theme, though, that is important to note, we had some precipitation in some places that needed it. We had over 2 inches of rainfall in southeast Kansas. We had over an inch of rainfall in northwest Kansas with rain and snow. So some quiet winters with this storm that we need to take, because those are areas that have missed a lot of the recent precipitation.
Are we going to see a similar cycle as we look into the forecast for next week?
Yeah, so we're into March. March typically comes in like a lion, and I definitely say it did. And unfortunately, it looks we still have that persistent La Nina condition in East Pacific, and still that negative PDO as well in the North Pacific, and that's going to allow for a very active storm pattern as we go through the rest of the month of March. And I think this is the first of likely many spring storms to come, which is not atypical, right? We get the warm air slowly starting to win out the battle. Our warmer days are getting a little bit warmer. Now when we're cold, we're getting to freezing or just below freezing. And when we look at the overall trends, warmer is winning more than cold. And that's what we'd expect as we go into spring. Those clashes, those air masses result in big temperature swings and big potent storm systems. So it does look like we're going to miss the gun with the storm system on Friday. That's going to go to our north and take snow up to Nebraska. And then this weekend, we're going to miss the next storm. It's going to go to our south. And you look at the precipitation forecast, and there's a big donut hole in Kansas where we're not expecting anything for the next 7 days. So we're going to miss the next two, but we're still going to get breezy winds. And overall temperatures are going to slowly rise through the weekend. And then by Monday, that warm air makes a big return with strong southwest winds. Looks like we'll have some gusts up to 40 miles an hour with low humidity and temperatures skyrocketing to the mid to upper 70s, maybe even 80s in western Kansas. And that's the leadway of warmer air in advance of the next very potent storm system that looks to arrive middle to late next week. And models are being very aggressive with it as well, with a tight pressure gradient resulting in a lot of wind. And it does appear again, and this has been the trend the last couple of storms, the big ones, that they're going a little bit further north and we're not getting into as widespread of moisture. That looks to be the case again, where fire weather might be the highest risk in southwest Kansas, and then overall wind will be the most widespread conditions. Precipitation, again, will be isolated as well, with the most snow going to our north. We'll see a lot of time for that system to change its track, and it can have big impacts. But, again, models look like they're going to cycle, and 5-6 days later, we're going to have another storm system. So we're going to keep this active pattern to the end of the month.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.